The sound of splintering would jolted me awake at 3:04 a.m. 3 men in matching polo shirts burst through my front door, clipboards raised like shields, shouting, "HOA compliance check." The lead intruder, a man with slick back hair and the aura of someone who peaked in high school, waved a laminated badge that looked like it came from a dollar store craft kit. His 2 accomplices flanked him, one wearing night vision goggles that were clearly on backwards, the other clutching a measuring tape like it was a weapon. The smell of excessive cologne mixed with energy drinks filled my living room. Before I could process what was happening, I heard a familiar sound from the hallway, the unmistakable click of a shotgun safety being switched off. My father emerged from the shadows, all 6 feet 3 inches of him, holding his vintage Remington like he was back in Afghanistan. At 68 years old, the retired Navy SEAL still moved with a precision that made enemy combatants surrender without firing a shot. He tilted his head slightly, studying the intruders with the same calm he used to assess hostile territories. Then he spoke, his voice carrying that special quality that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "You boys lost?" The fake HOA enforcers didn't need a second invitation to leave. They scrambled over each other, trying to exit through the door they just destroyed, clipboards flying, night vision goggles clattering to the floor. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a 36-year-old software developer who moved to Pine Ridge Estate specifically because it didn't have an HOA. I work from home, keep to myself, and my biggest controversy is winning the annual chili cook-off 3 years running with a recipe that includes dark chocolate. The neighborhood suited me perfectly with its mature oak trees, quiet streets, and complete lack of busybody committees telling me what color to paint my shutters. That all changed when Preston Caldwell decided to create his own HOA out of thin air. Preston, a 43-year-old self-proclaimed entrepreneur who drove a leased BMW and referred to himself as the Community Excellence Coordinator, had apparently grown bored with his latest failed business venture. One morning, flyers appeared on every doorstep bearing an eagle logo that looked suspiciously traced from an energy drink can. Notice from the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, they declared in Comic Sans font. According to Preston, he was revitalizing a dormant HOA charter that he claimed existed from 1972. Nobody had ever heard of such a charter, but Preston insisted he'd found the documents in the county archives. What he'd actually done was create an elaborate scam with his 2 cousins, billing neighbors for phantom violations and pocketing the money. The harassment started small. A notice appeared on my door claiming my mailbox was 3 degrees off perpendicular, demanding a $75 adjustment fee. Then came the complaint about my garden gnome facing the wrong cardinal direction, apparently violating subsection 12.4 of the newly minted community standards. I laughed these off until things escalated. My shed was egged in the middle of the night. Someone superglued my mailbox shut. I caught Preston on my security camera at 2 a.m., measuring my driveway with a laser level and muttering about non-compliance penalties. When I confronted him the next day, he claimed it was a routine perimeter verification authorized by the HOA board. "What board?" I asked. He rattled off 3 names that turned out to be his cousin's and his mother's maiden name. That's when I started digging deeper and talking to neighbors. Margaret Sullivan, the retired librarian 3 houses down, showed me a bill for $200 for excessive dandelion proliferation. Tom Chin paid $300 to register his daughter's tricycle as an approved recreational vehicle. The Patel family received a $500 fine for hanging prayer flags without submitting the proper cultural expression permits. None of us had ever voted for an HOA. There were no meetings, no bylaws, no legitimate registration with the state. Preston had simply decided to start sending bills and threats, betting that people would pay rather than fight. I compiled evidence and took it to the police, showing them the fake letterhead, the made-up violation codes, and the trail of fraudulent fees. The officer listened patiently, then shrugged. "Sounds like a civil matter," he said, suggesting I hire a lawyer. Preston must have had friends monitoring the police reports because the harassment intensified immediately. Suddenly, I was getting 3 notices a day. My grass was simultaneously too long and too short. My house numbers weren't reflective enough. My doorbell played an unapproved chime. The fines now totaled over $2,000, with threats of liens and legal action if I didn't pay within 72 hours. Preston started showing up at odd hours, always with his cousins Brad and Tyler, taking photos and measurements. They wore matching polos with HOA Enforcement Division embroidered on them. I installed more cameras and posted the footage online, which only made Preston bolder. He sent a cease and desist letter claiming I was violating the HOA's social media policy. The letter was signed by a law firm that, upon investigation, turned out to be a P.O. box registered to Preston's ex-girlfriend. The situation reached a boiling point when Preston announced mandatory compliance inspections. According to his latest fabrication, the HOA had the right to enter any property at any time to ensure adherence to community standards. Most neighbors were too intimidated or confused to resist. That's when Preston made his fatal error by scheduling my inspection for 3 a.m. on a Saturday, precisely when my father was visiting for the weekend. Dad had arrived Friday afternoon for what was supposed to be a quiet weekend of fishing and catching up. 30 years in the Navy SEALs had given him a particular set of skills and an even more particular hatred of people who abuse authority. When I told him about Preston's fake HOA, he just nodded and went back to cleaning his fishing reels. I should have recognized that look. It was the same expression he wore before operations that would later be classified. At exactly 3:04 a.m., Preston and his enforcement squad attempted their grand entrance. What they didn't know was that Dad had been awake since 2:30, doing his usual perimeter check out of habit. He'd already identified their van parked down the street, noted their approach pattern, and positioned himself in the optimal defensive position. The moment they broke through the door, shouting about compliance checks, Dad was ready. While I called 911, Dad employed what he later described as aggressive negotiation tactics. Without raising his voice or his weapon above chest level, he herded the three intruders toward the backyard. Preston tried to assert his authority, waving his clipboard and citing made-up ordinances. Dad responded by reciting actual federal laws about breaking and entering, fraud, and impersonating government officials. By the time Preston realized he'd severely miscalculated, Dad had already maneuvered them into my garden shed. The three men found themselves locked inside with my neighbor's escaped pet, a particularly territorial raccoon named Winston, who'd taken up residence there the week before. The police arrived 20 minutes later to find three grown men huddled in the corner of my shed, crying and begging to be let out. Winston had claimed the opposite corner and was stress-eating the bag of trail mix Tyler had in his pocket. The officers took one look at the scene, then at my father calmly sipping coffee on the porch, and immediately understood the situation. The evidence was overwhelming. In Preston's van, they found boxes of fake violation notices, a credit card reader linked to an offshore account, and a business plan outlining the expansion of his fake HOA empire to 6 other neighborhoods. His laptop contained spreadsheets tracking over $18,000 in fraudulent fees collected from Pine Ridge residents over the past 8 months. There were template letters threatening legal action, forged county documents, and a Pinterest board labeled Intimidation Inspo, full of aggressive font choices. The cousins cracked immediately, admitting everything and trying to pin it all on Preston. Brad revealed that they'd been splitting the money 3 ways and using it to fund Preston's cryptocurrency day trading, which had lost most of it anyway. Tyler showed the officers a group chat where Preston detailed plans to expand the scam, including hiring actors to play board members and creating a fake website with payment portals. Preston himself tried to maintain his story until the officers pointed out that his HOA enforcement badges were clearly printed on the same home printer as the violation notices, complete with the same misaligned ink cartridge that left a distinctive streak across every document. The prosecutor called it one of the most elaborate HOA fraud schemes she'd ever seen. Preston faced charges of fraud, extortion, impersonating a government official, breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, and racketeering. His cousins agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. The trial was swift. Preston showed up in a suit that still had the rental tags on it, trying to argue that he was providing a valuable community service. The judge, clearly unimpressed, pointed out that legitimate HOAs don't conduct armed invasions at 3 a.m. or threaten residents with made-up violations. Mr. Caldwell, she said, leaning forward, you created an elaborate criminal enterprise based on exploiting your neighbor's assumption that authority figures are legitimate. You broke into homes, extorted money, and terrorized a peaceful community for personal gain. The evidence was undeniable. Every fake notice, every fraudulent fee, every threatening letter was presented in excruciating detail. Former victims testified about the stress and financial hardship Preston had caused. Mrs. Chen broke down crying, explaining how she'd skipped medical appointments to pay his bogus fines, terrified of losing her home. Preston's defense attorney, a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried to argue that Preston believed he was acting within his rights. The judge dismissed this with a snort. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, counselor, and your client wasn't ignorant. He was counting on everyone else being ignorant while he robbed them. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Preston's face went from confident to confused to completely deflated as each verdict was read. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to all victims. Preston's jaw dropped. 5 years, he sputtered. But it was just an HOA. The judge's response was withering, no, Mr. Caldwell. It was organized crime with a clipboard. As the bailiffs led him away, Preston turned to look at the gallery, his eyes wide with shock, still unable to comprehend how his suburban scam had landed him a federal conviction and half a decade behind bars.